But did you also know they're very easy to grow? And that's what we're going to do today. And the best way to grow them and to grow anything is organically, without pesticides or fungicides or any of those nasty things. And this method is super easy. All you need is an old potato, and this one's been in the cupboard for a while and it's got some sprouts coming out. And you need some compost or straw, some soil, and some old car tyres. And if you live on a farm, there's bound to be some old tyres lying around. If you live in town, you might be able to get one from the local garage. All you do, and this is so easy, is put your potato in the ground and put some soil over it. It looks a bit funny here, but you'd actually plant it in the soil and then put some compost or straw over the top. Then put one of these tyres around the potato, like that. Now you leave it for a while and the potato will start to sprout up through the soil. And when that happens, you put some more compost and more soil on top, cover the plant with that, and then pop another tyre on top of that. And eventually you'll have a pile of 3 or 4 tyres, and inside the potato plant will grow up gradually, and you'll have dozens of potatoes growing around in there. And we've got some here for you to have a look at. They're rather sick-looking potato plants, but that's probably because they were planted at the wrong time of the year. Anyway, they're doing well, and inside those tyres you will find lots of little potatoes. A couple of things to remember: don't forget to water them, and don't cover the plant too thickly with soil because it might just give up and die. You've got to give it a bit of room to get through. And now, a couple of interesting things about potatoes from my very handy Pocket World book on potatoes. And this tells us that a potato isn't a root like a carrot, and it's not a bulb like an onion or a fruit like a rhubarb. In fact, it's a tuber, which means it's a kind of swelling in the roots of the plant. And there's a very attractive, healthy-looking potato plant. And this also tells us that the fruit of the potato, and it does have a fruit, is poisonous. And that's because it's from the deadly nightshade family. And did you know that one potato planted could give us 15 or 20 new potatoes? So from one of these, you get quite a lot of new potatoes. And the way a potato grows is it feeds off what you plant in the ground. So if you plant a potato like that, it'll grow up through the ground and then you'll get swellings in the roots, and those new potatoes it produces will actually feed off the existing potato, and the existing potato will shrivel up, and eventually that will almost disappear because the new potatoes feed on the food of the old potato. And potatoes came from South America, and they were first brought to Europe in 1570, but people refused to eat them and they fed them to their pigs. They didn't know what they were missing out on, did they? There are lots of different potatoes. We've got a few over here. They're all delicious to eat, and if you don't put butter or cream with them or cook them in fat, they're not at all fattening. And, by the way, that little book is published by Heinemann and costs $7.95. And there are lots more in the series, including all about pigs and bees, ants and termites, and chocolate tea and coffee. And this is one of my favourites. And it tells us that the Aztecs used dried cocoa beans as money, and 10 cocoa beans bought a rabbit. And it's got some great illustrations in it. It's a really good series. And now let's have a look at our letters for this week. And our first letter comes from Frank Calabria, who comes from Hanwood in New South Wales. And Frank says, "Thank you for telling us all about Australian animals and about our country that we live in. I live on a vineyard, which is 50 acres, and we also have oranges. Apart from grapes, we have oranges, wheat, rice and sheep." And he's 6 years old, he plays the violin and soccer, and he sent us a wonderful photograph of himself in a dressing gown. That's great. And we'll be sending you the potato book. Thanks very much, Frank. And we have a letter from Delida Mamalito, who comes from St James in Western Australia. And Delida says she collects all sorts of things, and she loves animals, and she has a dog named Bronson. And her brother and she really enjoy the show, and while she's at school, she tells Gran to tape it on the video. That's great. She did have 24 fish, 2 birds, 7 guinea pigs, 2 cockatoos, and they all died. And it's sad. And she did have photos of them, but she can't find them. When she does, she'll send them in. Thank you very much for your letter, Delida. And she sent us the photo of herself with her dog. That's great. And we also have a letter from Mark Lyle, who comes from Albany in Western Australia. And he says that he enjoyed the show we did about dogs and cats, and he has a duck named Daisy. And he sends a photo of Daisy with her ducklings. They're all having a little bath. And he has a dog named Boomer and a cat called Blackie. And he says he hopes to keep watching the show. Well, I hope you keep watching the show too, Mark. That's fantastic. And if you've got something to tell us about the town where you live, or what you do at school, or the pets you have, write in and let us know.
That's a good idea, Maxine. In fact, there's our Earthwatch address on the screen right now. And if you'd like to send us a photo, please do. But remember to send along a second envelope with your name and your address on it so that we can return it to you afterwards. Well, in World Watch, some sad news now for some of the ocean's friendliest creatures. More than 200 dolphins have died mysteriously in the Atlantic Ocean off the east coast of America. Marine biologists studying the problem say they seem to be dying of common bacterial infections caused by bacteria which usually wouldn't affect them. Nobody knows why the dolphins are no longer immune. Dolphins aren't fish, but mammals like man. So could this be a kind of dolphin AIDS?
I certainly would not call it dolphin AIDS. There are a number of conditions, chemical, infectious agents, that are capable of compromising the immune system, including the common cold. And so I would more than hesitate to make the analogy.
Researchers haven't ruled out man-made pollutants as the cause of death. However, no other marine life has been affected by this new disease. So the study goes on to try and bring them back to health. While we're getting ready to plant our tomato crop here in Australia, residents of Bunol near Valencia in Spain have a unique way of beginning their festivities. To celebrate the end of the tomato harvest, the younger residents of the town douse each other in overripe tomatoes. Thousands of tomatoes are pulped and splattered by the half-naked crowd. Well, I guess it's one way of making tomato soup or tomato sauce. At the end of the day, the only thing left to do is clean up the streets and some pretty red faces.
Yeah, red faces indeed.
How revolting.
Absolutely. Truckloads of mashed tomatoes. I wonder if I could lob one of these over to Paul there in his booth. Paul just sits quietly. Paul Higgins, you know Paul?
Hi, Paul.
Sits quietly over there, protected by his glass panel.
That's right.
Yeah, and throws all these amazing remarks at us from over there.
Just as long as you don't throw that tomato at me, thank you
No,
very
I
much.
won't do that, Paul. I wouldn't think of such a thing. Yeah. Actually, that was amazing, though. You could make a week's supply of soup out of tomato soup out of all those tomatoes, couldn't you?
You could. Imagine how it'd feel.
Yeah, incredible.
Yes. We've actually got Paul's first story.
Yes, yes. We got Paul out of the studio here and took him out into Port Phillip Bay in Melbourne. And well, quite often on Earthwatch we have stories about endangered species. And well, Paul went out to investigate a species that's not only not endangered, but it's actually in plague proportions. And believe it or not, it's the humble seagull.
Well, for most of us, the silver gull, or the common seagull, is a fairly attractive and a fairly inoffensive sort of bird. I mean, we can take it or leave it. And mostly, if you give it half a chance, it will come and take your lunch away from you. But this bird that we find so often at the beach or at picnics in the park is now increasing in numbers uncontrollably.
Maybe you've noticed them in the parks, on the football oval, at the cricket, or even right in the middle of the city. This could be a scene from a horror movie, and these kamikaze seabirds are also making their presence felt at our airports.
This rubbish tip that you see behind me is in the flight path of an airport that's not very far away. It's just a couple of kilometres away over the back. Now, that's where rubbish tips are the key to the problem. You see, all these thousands of seagulls down here are having a wonderful time feasting on the beautiful, delicious rubbish that's down there. And not only that, they're also breeding up in the back parts, along with some pelicans too. The problem is that all these birds around the place could come in contact with an aeroplane and cause a very serious accident.
But where do the gulls all come from? The answer lies many miles away across the bay.
Well, right now we're finding ourselves in the middle of Port Phillip Bay, just near an island that perhaps not too many people have heard of, called Mud Island. It's a sort of a muddy, or it looks actually a fairly sandy little formation in the middle of the bay. Now, once there was enough space here on Mud Island for about 5 different species of bird to breed upon. Back in 1959, when people first started looking at the bird life in Mud Island, there were only about 8 pairs of seagulls. But these days, it's estimated there's more than 100,000 birds on this island. They're certainly kicking up quite a racket. I can believe that figure. Why don't we go and take a look at it? What's this got to do with the rubbish tips? Let's take a look at their daily flight path. First stop is our rubbish tips for some breakfast and maybe some lunch. Second stop is the city for afternoon tea and dinner. And then it's back to Mud Island for the night. Their numbers have been well fed by our rubbish. They've overwhelmed the local bird population, and the gulls have been eating the eggs and the young of other species, such as terns and storm petrels. Ian Tenby has been looking into Mud Island's problems. Well, tell me, Ian, why is it that the seagulls keep multiplying in numbers so much, but the other seabirds don't?
The seagulls are opportunistic feeders, which means that they'll feed on a great range of different things, whereas the terns and the cormorants, which also nest here, feed only on fish.
How often do the seagulls lay their eggs?
Well, if you keep taking their eggs away, they'll keep laying them, but normally one nest will only have a maximum of 3 eggs in it.
Well, these eggs that we can see down here, how long does it take them to hatch?
About 22 days.
How long would that chick have been hatched for now, the one sitting shivering in the middle?
Well, I would think no longer than yesterday, probably 1 day old.
And how long will it take the other one that's trying to hatch at the moment to get out of there?
I'd say probably 2 or 3 hours. It's quite a struggle for them.
Well, once that these chicks hatch, is there any danger for them after that?
Probably the only danger on a place like Mud Island is from other gulls, because once the chicks leave the nest, if they wander into another gull's territory, they get pecked and can be killed that way. Apart from that, there are no predators, no foxes or cats or anything on Mud Island, so it's just about perfect for them.
Well, I guess you could probably call this just about the most perfect breeding ground in the world then.
I think Mud Island is probably one of the largest gull colonies in the world.
Ian's studies include leg banding the chicks. Later, by using a telescope to read the bands, he can find out a lot about the life cycle of the gulls. And some of his results have been really surprising.
Last week when I was out here, I found a bird that was banded in Gladstone, Queensland on the 27th of April. That's some 2,200 kilometres.
It's a long way to travel, isn't it?
Sure is.
Is that a usual sort of thing to happen?
Well, it seems that young birds, after they leave Mud Island, disperse quite widely up into New South Wales and down into South Australia, but to come back here again to breed, as a rule, some 2 or 3 years later.
Well, the Victorian government agrees that something does have to be done about the gull population. I mean, there's nests there, right through this vegetation. There are nests everywhere. The problem is, what do we do about it? Some gun clubs have offered to shoot the birds, but that's met with strong opposition from animal conservation groups. Another answer is maybe to cover up all that rubbish that the seagulls thrive on so well. The problem is they have tried that, and the seagulls still manage to find their way through and get at it anyway. Another answer is maybe to destroy the unhatched eggs or feed the seagulls a birth control drug. But the problem there is it all takes a lot of money and a lot of time to do something about controlling the population. Well, Ian, you're the man who's got to find the solution. What is the answer?
Well, Paul, there's no single answer, no simple solution to this problem. It's a complex problem. There is some hope on the horizon for reducing access by the gulls to rubbish at tips by introducing a new system of baling rubbish, and this is practiced by one council around Melbourne at the current time. And at that tip, there are very, very few gulls, in contrast to the many thousands that can be seen at other tips. Another alternative that needs to be practiced is to feed the gulls a drug to kill them. It's a drug overdose. the effect of the drug is to make them go to sleep and they don't wake up. We believe this is a humane solution, but it probably would not be acceptable to many people. Unfortunately, because the gulls cause a hazard to aircraft at around Melbourne's 3 airports, something needs to be done.
Well, as the sun slowly sets on Mud Island, we get into this week's creature feature.
Yes, Paul, and this creature feature often lives in rabbit burrows, but it isn't a rabbit.
Well, it's often said to be cunning too, Maxine.
Yes, and it had a dance named after the way it walks.
And I believe it lives on fruits and berries in summer.
Stranger and stranger.
What could it be?
Oh!
And here is something
How
really
beautiful.
special, a wonderful red fox.
Oh, what a
Look at
lovely colour. Can I pat it?
Yes, you can. This is George the fox, George the red fox, and George is terribly tame and absolutely quite a wonderful animal.
And what an interesting smell George has.
Yes, it's a typically foxy smell. They use that smell produced by glands down under his tail to mark out his territory so that he knows where he lives and other foxes know where George lives and won't come and trespass.
Can you smell him?
Can you smell the strong foxy smell? Yeah, it's pretty strong, isn't it? It's got a beautiful tail. All foxes have this wonderful brush at the back. I've got a chain because I'm not allowed to let him loose in here, but look at that beautiful tail.
Actually, some people do
Isn't that
terrible
superb?
things with these tails.
But we won't talk about that. No, that would be terrible. But they're wonderful, aren't they? Isn't it great? Yeah. Foxes, of course, are not native to Australia. They were introduced to Australia back in the 1860s, and they were introduced for a very strange reason. They were introduced because humans like to take foxes out, let them loose in the bush, get on a horse, and get some dogs and gallop around the countryside chasing the fox, and then killing it. And they thought that was a pretty good sport. I think I'd rather watch a football match, actually, myself. But so they introduced foxes to Australia back at that time. And in fact, the foxes took over here very nicely. They found Australia to be a wonderful place for foxes. And by only 1907, about 30 or 40 years later, they'd spread right across the continent as far as Perth. Couldn't go much further, of course, because they all went up in the sea. But they're really quite superb animals. They're obviously dogs, doggy-type animals. And lots of dogs like wolves and the wild dogs and so on hunt in packs. But these ones are solitary hunters, and they are extremely skillful, hence the cunning expression.
Oh,
it's
yes,
really
they've
more
got-
skill than cunning.
Yes. And they're very cautious, aren't they?
They are extremely cautious. Here's one racing out like greased lightning, catching
That
a
was so
rabbit.
quick.
Yeah. And the only really safe place for the rabbit is back in one of those thorn thickets, which the fox really doesn't like to go into.
Well, of course, it wouldn't be much good to go back in its burrow because the foxes can go in their burrows,
Yes,
can't they?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So they actually love rabbits. They think rabbits are about the tastiest thing on 4 legs. But of course, in summer, as you mentioned earlier, they actually eat fruits and berries.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
odd, isn't it?
Yeah, they've got a bit of a sweet tooth, I guess.
Yes.
Which is nice. There's some wonderful film that was taken in England some years back using those special sniper scopes, the night vision cameras that were developed by the military to get really nice pictures in total darkness. And they put these out in people's backyards in suburban London, and they discovered that there were quite a large number of foxes just having a wonderful foxy life in people's backyards, and no one knew they were there because they're so well camouflaged and they're so elusive and cunning and sly that people didn't know they were there, but they're rearing their young in people's backyards, you know, underneath the aspidistra. There'd be a whole horde of little baby foxes, and so they managed to film the whole life cycle, raising the cubs and going off, and the young ones growing up and then going off on their own and so on.
That's
Quite marvellous.
incredible. Often when you see them here in Australia, actually, in the bush, They don't look terribly healthy, do they? They look sort of mangy.
I think some of them are actually having a pretty tough life of it, and so they're often feeding perhaps on garbage scraps and things like that. And so they get a bit undernourished, and then the parasites take over, and they're not well cared for. Not like dear George here, who looks as though he's been the most pampered fox in all history.
George has got a fantastic coat, actually, and their fur is quite valuable, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Ladies love to wear their fur.
They do, although we won't say that in George's hearing. Actually, I've got a little hunting horn here. This is a little souvenir my brother sent back to me from England. That's the kind of hunting horn that these silly people used to use when they wanted to go out dressed up in red finery and galloping across the fields, you know. Yoicks, yoicks. I'll put it away.
David.
I'll put it away in case George spots it, because it might make him upset. It could spoil his whole day. Yeah. So there. Would you like to have a little pat? Have you ever patted a fox before?
Look at his tail.
How about having a little pat? He won't bite. He's a terribly, terribly gentle fox.
Can you pat his tail?
See his long, slender paws too. Very, very thin paws, aren't they? Really quite wonderful. Yeah.
He's lovely.
That's great. Yeah, I had thought that the male fox used to sometimes bring food back for the cubs, and I think that does happen, but pretty soon after that he just heads off and leaves the rearing of the young to mum, and he goes off and lives by himself mostly, I guess. They are actually extremely solitary. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So there are many foxes in Australia at the moment, and they are a problem in some parts of the country because, of course, they do eat small mammals, chickens, and so on. And so farmers don't like them very much.
No.
But I think, you know, it's a shame that they're introduced in a way because it's not their fault. They wind up in a very tricky situation with, you know, nobody liking them very much. But it's kind of a shame for the fox because the fox is quite a wonderful animal after all.
Yes.
Yeah. So there we are. Isn't he cute?
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
And next week?
Next week, yes. We've got a fantastic show next week.
Yes, next week we milk a cow.
Next week, you milk a cow?
No. You're going to milk the cow.
No, you told me you grew up on a farm.
Yes,
you're going to milk the cow.
Yes,
Come on.
David, but it was a sheep farm and you don't milk sheep, generally speaking.
Next week we're going to shear a cow.
And we're also going to look at one of Australia's most brilliant mimics.
Yes, that's true, and it's not Max Gillies.
No. Actually, speaking of milking cows, we got an interesting letter from Nicole Hyde, who comes from Five Dock in New South Wales. And in the Christmas holidays, she went to Bateman's Bay, and while they were there, they went to the rotalactor. And a rotalactor is where the cows get milked on a rotating platform by machines.
Rotalactor, what an amazing word.
Isn't that? A whole lot easier than milking it by hand.
Yeah.
And she says we were allowed to feel the suction cups that get the milk out, and they feel like a weak vacuum cleaner.
Terrific.
And when she went to Taronga Park Zoo, she milked the cows by hand, and that's what we're going to do. I mean, you're going to do.
Here we go again, yeah. However, for now, we have to go because it's time to go and get dinner.
Right.
For us.
Bye for now.
We'll see you next week. Bye.